Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Keim Report wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Ampire Media, Ampire. Always much appreciated when you tune in. Don't forget you can read my work on ESPN.com. I have a story up now about 5 commanders who are entering key contract years. Could be the last year of their deal, could be somebody who's got a couple more years left, but if you don't have a big year, you may not be here in the future. So big years for those guys up on ESPN.com. Bram and I will be back talking about this very article next week and just going in a little bit more depth and detail about some of these players and the expectations for them. So there you go, up on ESPN.com now. In a minute, I'm going to talk about something else I wrote earlier, but I want to go into more depth here about the run defense, why they feel the run defense will be better. Obviously, it's deeply important that it is. So I get to that in a minute. Before I get there, a couple things. As I'm sure you know, former minority partner Fred Smith died a couple days ago. Yes, once upon a time, he wanted to buy this team, and Dan Snyder got it instead, and the rest is history. Now, a couple things that wouldn't have changed, the name would have changed earlier, right? That would have still happened because Fred Smith was a big proponent of that. And I believe it was with investors or shareholders for FedEx that he had said that one time. That was his desire. And of course, one of the things that got the ball rolling with that whole 5 years ago with the name change was a FedEx coming out and saying that they had talked to the team about changing the name from Redskins to something else. So, anyways, but he was a longtime minority partner with Snyder, and there you go. So, and also the other thing is the Commanders named the draft room after Bobby Beathard, a former general manager during the heyday, a great general manager. Uh, that was obviously the organization was pretty damn good when he was here during the 80s. He left, Charlie Casserly took over. But Bobby Beathard was a key architect of those Super Bowl winning teams. So they named the draft room after him. He has a son, Jeff, who works for the organization as a scout. So a very nice gesture, but I do think it highlights again how tied this organization wants to be to its past, and which is smart because the past is there. And, regardless of they change the name or not, the past is still their past and they are connected to it. And I think you'll continue to see that present itself in different ways. So, however whatever those ways are, they're not going to run away from that, nor should they. So anyways, there you go. That's it. Let's get to some thoughts on the run defense. And obviously they have to stop the run. This is not a big surprise. They were terrible at it last year. If they want to beat the Eagles, they have to do better. The Eagles rushed for more than 200 yards in each of the 3 games against them. Saquon Barkley went wild against them. He went wild against everybody. So, but he did average more yards per carry against Washington than the other teams. So here's a big thing. In the last 10 years, you want to look like this team wants to get to the Super Bowl, right? They want to win a Super Bowl. And I think they are capable of going into the season saying, hey, why not, right? There's no reason why they shouldn't feel like that. They reached the NFC Championship game. And I think in areas they have improved, and they have a quarterback who is ascending and just starting his ascent, right? And was really good. So why wouldn't you go into the season thinking that you have a shot at this? But you better stop the run. And so in the last 10 years, there have been 8 teams in the Super Bowl who were top 10 in yards per carry allowed and yards per game allowed against the run. There were only 3 teams that were 20th or worse in both categories who made the Super Bowl. Now, you can get, funny thing is and I have a list here. Kansas City won the Super Bowl with a defense that was ranked 26th in yards per game and 29th in yards per carry. The Chiefs also won in 2023, the defense that was 18th in yards per game and 24th in yards per carry. They have Patrick Mahomes. They have Travis Kelce. They have some Hall of Famers. They have a Hall of Fame coach. So they had other ways to win still, despite that. I think the Commanders have some pretty good things in place with that. Of course, with Jaden Daniels, that you could say, okay, if you aren't perfect in this area, you can still win because you have a special player at the most important position in the game. That's where Patrick Mahomes would come into play, right? So that's how you can get there. Otherwise, and they do have that, they have ways to overcome a deficiency like that. I just don't think you can be really, really bad in one area and better in others and still think that you're there at this point. So they've got to improve for sure. Um, so the point is with if your goal is to win a Super Bowl, it's hard to do unless you're better in this area. Again, they don't have to be perfect in here. They just can't be in the bottom 3 or 4 of the teams in the league because I think it's I told you like I want to say that like the last 3 years, maybe I think it's 4 teams have made the playoffs ranked in the bottom 10 in rushing yards per game. So you can't, it's a hard way to go to live like that. So they know that. It's why an offseason was spent trying to fix the defensive line. They added size. You get Dietrich Wise, Eddie Goldman, Javon Kinlaw. I think that matters. And, I think when you look at it with, Goldman, can he still be an effective nose tackle? Well, I know the Falcons' defense improved against the run when he was on the field, but what does that mean for him? Is that all because of him or some other factors, right? And is he as good as he was before? Well, probably not. But is he better than what they had there? Does he give them something here that they haven't had? I think the answer is yes. So you've got size in the middle there, and he's not going to be a guy that's going to move too far laterally, but he's got to be he's got to be a presence in the middle when he plays. I don't and how much he plays and how they rotate him, what they do have with him is depth. So, and I think you can create some packages where maybe he's more effective in them. You have Javon Kinlaw. He's shown flashes. Like he had some plays with the Jets last year where he's tossing guys aside and getting after the ball carrier. Then he's other plays where he's getting moved out. Which guy is going to show up? And I'll get to him in a minute as well. You have Dietrich Wise, who they liked him for his edge setting ability. And he just offers you more size there, and it gives you a deeper rotation at defensive end, something they didn't have last year. Like they had Cleveland Farrell, but he's dealing with a knee injury. Well, if he's healthy, that helps them. And if he doesn't have to deal with that, that was a lingering issue from the previous year, the previous playoff run with San Francisco that affected him last year as well. So that matters. But you get Wise in there. I think he's better, certainly as an edge setter, than what Dante Fowler is. And Dante Fowler had to start playing more because they didn't have the depth there, because Farrell would be out. Dorrance Armstrong, I think, is a solid NFL football defensive end. And then I think the other factor was Javonte Jean-Baptiste was a rookie last year. Now I do think that they are optimistic about what he can do as part of the rotation. So you have more depth of guys there who can set the edge. And that's important because when you look at a guy like Bobby Wagner, can he do what he once did? No. So you've got to give him some other, but can he still help? Yes. And you have to help him though by setting a strong edge, right? So by setting a strong edge, you're going to force, are you able to force guys more back to the middle or force them wider around the end and just string plays out, whether it's for Wagner or Lulu, whomever it is, right? Just to be able to do that, it's a big deal. That was not done consistently last year, and time and again, it really hurt them. And so I think they should be better in that area. And with Kinlaw, as I've talked to you before, like the plan is to use him inside. There will be packages where he's probably playing outside with like the 3 defensive tackle sets and all that. So that's the package they like to use. I think the size really helps. And you look at like last year, John Allen, can still play. Like John Allen can still be a good defensive tackle in this league. He's a smaller defensive tackle at this point. He even said like last year, the older he got, the more he'd lose a little bit of weight going into a season to maintain that quickness. So he was down to 280, 285 in that range. And, you have Payne is in that 300 range. So, Johnny Newton is a smaller defensive tackle. So you needed some size in there. Sheldon Day, a smaller defensive tackle. You needed some size in there, and they got that with Goldman. They got that with Kinlaw for sure. Now, what that means, we'll see. But they definitely added size. In fact, here's what Daron Payne had to say about the run defense, why it's important, but also, why maybe he thinks it'll be better, but also the size. Here's what he had to say.
Keys probably would just be the work that we put in. We just broke it down this year on the technique that we want to play. So we just paying real close attention to our run technique and how we creating a new line of scrimmage and playing with heavy hands and all that stuff.
How much does size help? added
Oh,
size.
size definitely helps. Size helps. We got some big guys in Kinlaw and Wise. They can play big end and play 4 eye and all that stuff. So it definitely helps.
So the other part with Kinlaw is what are they getting in him? And we've talked a lot about this since he signed, but I will say they are optimistic. And again, I always point out Dan Quinn cut his teeth coaching defensive linemen. Daryl Tapp coached him. And Adam Peters was in San Francisco when they drafted him and watched him play for a number of years. They believe he can be really good for them because of just what he has shown over the last year or so. And a big part of the big part of it, folks, is the health. Like he's had multiple seasons where he got hurt and was on IR, and that affects not only your season but your off season. So I think what they like with him and the reason why they feel he's still ascending is because he was healthy. He finished the year healthy. He had a good off season last year where he's healthy, finished the year healthy, off season healthy. I know he had to miss some time in camp, but it was nothing where he was able to work out this offseason and work on his game. Whereas if you're rehabbing an injury, it always impacts your ability to strengthen yourself and work on your game. So they believe that that's why he is still an ascending player. And it's why they had no problem giving him a 3-year deal for 15 million per year. It does sound like there were other teams involved. I'm not sure who was all involved. That's why you get a 3-year deal for that. But the other thing is for a defensive tackle, again, I've told you before, like the cap hit this year is just is around 7 million. Next year would be 18 million. If he plays well, that's a good sum for a good defensive tackle if that's what he produces. He's got to do that. But he's got that size and he does have some explosiveness. Can you get him to be more consistent? That will be the key. But that's where they feel like the consistency for them with him comes in consistent health, right? Like if he's just having that year as a healthy guy, having a healthy offseason, that they feel will translate into better, more success on the field. So, and that's why they feel he's still developing. So even though he's going into, I think is his 6th year, they believe that he's just now getting to where he should be as far as a player. So we'll see how that unfolds, but it's why they're optimistic and it's why they wanted to sign him this offseason. So they also have increased versatility with this group because of what they've signed. You have 3 defensive tackle sets where you can go with Goldman over the nose with Payne and Kinlaw. That's a big group, and you have some quickness with Payne, and you have some quickness with Kinlaw. So, but that is a bigger group in a 3 defensive tackle set. You can go with the quicker one with Johnny Newton in there with Payne and Kinlaw. That gives you 3 guys who have some, good quickness off the ball. So you have more options than I think you did last year in those sets, which is key when they face some of these teams like the Eagles who like to run out of 12 and 13 personnel. And another guy to watch with this is, again, Javonte Jean-Baptiste, how he develops. I think they feel pretty good about what he did last year and how he could develop. It's really hard to tell. You should know this, but it's really hard to tell in the spring how some of these guys are playing. You can see them what they're doing, but they're in shorts and helmet. Like you're really not gonna, you could go out there and look really good as a defensive tackle or defensive lineman because you're not in pads, right? And the same with their offensive line. You measure them when you see them with their pads on. When you start to see like some of the one-on-one pass rush things or just how they play in tandem, how they work together, all that stuff. But you're not going to tell what they're doing. So you can hear that a guy is progressing in the spring. That's great, but we've got to see it when the pads are on. But I think Javonte Jean-Baptiste is somebody to watch. Is it, not to someone who's going to, I don't think he's going to break into the starting lineup, but I think as a strong rotational piece, can he be that guy? So that's one of the things I've always felt like if you look at this defensive line, they don't have anybody like the Giants do, no pass rusher like that. They don't have a Jalen Carter on this group. They don't have Micah Parsons. They didn't draft an Ezraku like the Cowboys did, right? So they don't have that top defensive lineman, but could they have and if you look at the defensive lines in this conference in the division, they're probably 4th, right? They need to be better than they were last year because I do think there's some good defensive lines in the NFC East. So can they be much better and much improved where you can, and I think the improvement comes from the depth of what they have and some increased versatility in what they have. but you're still looking at like, you'd have to, the Giants have a really good defensive line. The Eagles have a good defensive line. Even though they lost a couple guys, so much, they still have really good players still there. And the Cowboys will be very interesting with Parsons and depending on how Ezra develops. So, but Parsons is a game wrecker and a game changer. So that gives them an edge. But like, can you have a strong group because of the rotation? Well, yes, I do think you can have that. And that's what they need to have for sure. So, and if you do that, now you're looking at a different group. Again, you may not have anybody that just says, oh, wow, this guy's awesome, like Jalen Carter or Parsons, but maybe you can have a really strong group just because of the depth and the rotation. And then in the fourth quarter, be able to finish off games better defensively because you've kept guys fresher. Now they did a good job with the rotation last year. They did rotate guys, but you're rotating with better depth this year. So can you have more consistent play perhaps just because of that? So that's why they are hopeful. And I do think that's a legitimate thing. I do think they are better, stronger 1 through 9 than they were last year. Another key to me, and I think for them for sure, is Jordan McGee's development because he's a guy, and Joe Witt said this. They had plans for him to be a factor in some of their packages. Now you can't use a lot of 3 linebacker sets unless they're running heavy packages on offense. You can't run a 3 linebacker set if they're going out there and throwing out 3 receivers on you, because then who has to cover one of the receivers? Well, one of the linebackers. So you're not going to do that. It's a great way to get picked apart in the pass game. And so but you can use 3 linebacker sets when it calls for it. And when you look at those 12 and 13 personnel packages, that's what we was talking about. So let's look at some of these numbers against 12 and 13 personnel. And first of all, like the Eagles killed them in that spot. Against 12 and 13 personnel last year, they gave up 5.4 yards per carry. In the last 8 games, including the postseason, it was 7.2 yards per carry against those looks. Part of the problem was you use Michael Walker would be using that in that role. He could not cover, and so you get picked apart in that. They played it, he would be played in like goal line situations. Well, now you replace him with a younger, a big, strong guy in McGee. Can he be better in that area? We don't know. Like I know they like how he developed. I know they were optimistic about him last year. He looked good in training camp. We still don't know how it's going to look in a game, but he's a guy I think whose growth can really help this run defense in those packages. And like the Eagles, let's look at the Eagles. They ran against Washington last year. They ran out of 12 or 13 personnel 59 times. They averaged 6.1 yards per carry out of those sets against Washington. That has to change. So McGee's development is to me, would be crucial in that it gives you instead of having like Jeremy Chin, because they would use Chin in those roles as well. Instead of having Chin in that role as a big safety, now you have a linebacker. Like if you've seen McGee is jacked. McGee looks big and he has good speed. So he could be a big help in that role if he develops the way they hope. I mean, I've told you before, it's funny because sometimes people say like they didn't address Bobby Wagner's replacement. I've told you folks, this is a guy that if he develops is the guy that would replace Wagner eventually, whenever Wagner decides to hang him up, and whenever that situation occurs, chances are McGee will be the guy right now that would replace him. Now, if it doesn't work, then you've got to find a guy this offseason, but or whenever that time comes. But he's a guy whose development can be key in this area. I think Dominique Hampton, another guy that you could look at in a role like that because of his size. And it just could he be a guy that could play some of those big, if you had to go like to a big nickel situation, and you wanted somebody who can cover as well, could he be that guy? So, but anyways, they have some options there, but it starts with McGee because his growth and development will be key in terms of stopping and helping that area. But like, he didn't play enough last year because of injuries, and that took away that ability to really gauge like where's he at during games. We saw training camp, saw some of the preseason, but you didn't see it in the games because he didn't play enough. But I think he's a guy that could really help them in that way for sure. Um, And I think the other thing is if he can cover in those packages, because you see Walker is just not a cover guy, so he could be exploited that way. You 12 or 13 doesn't mean you're going to run the ball. It means that that's you just have a heavy package and you can throw on them, and they did. So, but I think there's the other way too that I wonder about when you talk about versatility. If McGee can go in there and play this role, well, now if you have like a 13 personnel, well, you can, if you wanted to help the run, you could go to a three safety and one corner look, because here's why. Will Harris, he can cover. He can cover. He's covered in the slot. You can use him in that way. They've testing him out in that way for sure against tight ends. See how he does, and he looked pretty good in the spring doing it. He's pretty solid in coverage. He's better than Chin was in coverage. Can Tyler Owens become a guy that does that, performs that role? And because they worked with him in the slot as well, um, covering. Now, just working him there, they were doing that this spring to see could he handle that. Well, I think we'll see more of that this summer to see can he do that. If he can that increase some of the packages that you add to your repertoire, which can then help against some of those packages because maybe you get some bigger bodies out there who can also play the pass. Now you have a chance to do something, and can they? We'll see. But I think that's something to think about, for sure. Um, so, anyways, and I think finally the other reason why they like one of the things, and this is one of the things I appreciate about Joe Whitt. Joe Whitt, a lot of times coaches get up there and they'll spout things about, well, we got to get better here, here, and here. I think Joe Whitt has shown over time that what if there is something to be done, like he's willing to look at what he does as a coach. And this is what again, sometimes coaches say things, but they don't implement it, and maybe they don't necessarily believe what they're saying. Like, yeah, we all have to get better, including me, but then they don't change. Well, I think Joe Witt has changed. There were some things last year with communication, like maybe early on in the year is like he kind of felt like he was putting too much on their plate. So he cut back on some of the things that he was asking them to do, not simplified it, but just reduced some of the things just to help with the communication, maybe clear up some of those issues and get him on. And I think they started playing a little bit better after that. But the bottom line is he looked at what he could do to help a situation, maybe what he was asked, maybe what he could do better in that situation. And that's something I think he's doing here. So for what I bring this up because they talked a lot about, or not a lot, but they talked a little bit about having the front seven work more together, being meetings more often together, and just working more together to get on the quote unquote same page. That matters. And so when you're talking about run fits, you need to understand where you need to go. When this look presents itself and then this happens, what do you do? And if you have them in the same group, you can now communicate. This is what I'm seeing. This is how I would react, or you see how they're reacting. Now you can learn how they handle certain situations a lot better. There were times in the past where the linebackers and the defensive line were not on the same page. I'm not even talking last year. And there were times last year too, but definitely in the previously, definitely times where I don't think that the linebackers or the D line they were in sync at all. And you would see it transfer to the run game, especially, right? Because you need to know how to read certain things. You need to know where you're going to go for your run fit if you want to make the stop. And I think doing something like this can make a difference. But I give like one thing that Dan Quinn has talked about too. If we're going to say you need to do this better, then what can we do better as coaches? So I think that definitely helps. And you can't give lip service to us because players would know if you say like, hey, we're going to do this better, I'm going to do this better, and the players don't see that you're doing that, they just think you're spouting lines for public consumption. But what Joe Witt says publicly, I do believe, based on what being around him and just seeing, also hearing about changes implemented, and him talking directly about what he plans to change, and that like because what they always do is okay, if you have issues like the run defense, you look at the players, you look at what you're asking them to do. Are they capable of that? And then are you looking at like, are we asking them, if you're a coach, you're asking, are we asking them to do the right things? Is it the scheme? Is it this? So I think they look at all that, and you have to be honest with yourself if you're going to do that. And through that, I think you get some changes. And I think not to make a huge deal out of it, but I do think it's a deal that you're having this group work together more. Just like I thought it was a big deal last year that I like the both sides of the ball, but that they worked way more on end of game situations or 2 minute drills, whatever. It was more, and I think it mattered. Now, Did it matter as much for the defense? Not as much, because I think there were some other issues, but it sure as hell helped the offense be better in those end of game situations. As number 5 helped them be better there too. But I think everybody, that you can't just have one guy doing it, but when you have a bunch of guys who feel comfortable in those spots, it makes a huge difference. So, but the point is, like, that emphasis on it last year made a big deal. And I think there was an emphasis this spring on getting that group together and working more together. In fact, this is what Dorrance Armstrong had to say about that.
Shoot, I mean, I'm not gonna say we didn't trust each other, but I think we got a little bit more time to get on the same page than we did last year. I think that was the main thing. The more time we have to learn the system that we're gonna be playing, the better we can be off.
And how can that, one of the big emphasis, stopping the run a little bit better than last year, how can that help that?
I mean, if you can't stop the run, you can't win games. So that's our big focus this year, is to be able to stop the run a lot better than what we did last year.
So finally, again, you just can't be horrible against the run like they were last year, because they just were not a complete defense. They've got to do other things better. They have to force more takeaways. They have to be, I brought up in one of the last, I did a 5 things I think last week, and talked about the fourth quarter defense and how bad it was. And just in terms of quarterback pressures, it was really bad. So for all you have to have a defensive end, folks, that's where it showed up. And I'm going to get into that in a couple other episodes down the road about some of that. But that's where it really showed up in terms of the pass rush. The pass rush overall was pretty good, but that's where it really showed up, was in the fourth quarter when you're trying to close out games. Can you do that? If you're better against the run, I think it gives you a better chance. I also think that will help the run is better coverage, right? Because now you can take something else away and maybe get off the field. So maybe you're not having to face the runway. Maybe you can get them in more 3rd and longs, because you're better against the run, and then you have tighter coverage because of Trey Amos, if Lattimore is healthy and productive, and then also Sam is still inside. And Will Harris in the secondary. I just think you should be better, definitely in coverage, which then helps, again, get you off the field and then keeps you fresher for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But all that stuff will help. But it starts with stopping the run and just being better. Can you get even out of the 20s against the run? That would help, and that would make them a better defensive unit, and it would start there. And then you can say, okay, with Jane Daniels at quarterback, then you get better here. Now you have a chance to really do something, because we look at that offense, like what they did last year and what they've added on that offensive line, it should be a very, very good unit. Again, even against a tougher schedule. But this run defense, you've got to be better, because if you're not, like, you have too many good quarterbacks and good teams coming up this year, they will exploit that if you're not. And so, anyways, that's why I wanted to talk about it today. Summertime, but still got to examine this, folks. So hope you're having a good summer, and I will be back on Thursday with another episode. I'm going to be talking to Eric Bickle from the Junkies. Just want to talk about his thoughts. Longtime fan, but he's also talked about this team on the air. I'm curious about where this team is at as far as, getting back to where it used to be from his perspective. Anyways, and a lot of other things with him. So anyway, so join me Thursday, and thanks for tuning in. Talk to you next time.